I'm only able to see my grandpa twice a year because he lives in a forested area of Alberta, Canada. To get to his house, we would have to take a 5 hour flight, a 2 hour taxi ride, and an hour hike through the woods. Because he lived in such a secluded part of the forest, he would only go over to the town to gather groceries and other essentials every 2 weeks. He would stock up his house with everything he needed and would live by himself, only the sights and sounds of the forest to keep him company. His house looked more like a cabin. It was well kept and a good size just for him. He had a small guest room that I would always sleep in whenever I came to visit, and my parents would sleep on the pull-out couch in the living room, because it was much larger than the bed in my room. The space was definitely tight, but it was cozy. My parents and I haven't been to visit him for 2 years, ever since my grandma died. My mom said it was because he began acting strange, and it made them uncomfortable. When I would question what she meant, she would always respond with, "He couldn't accept that grandma was dead." It broke my heart to think about how alone he must feel. He and grandma had been living in the forest together for 20 years. I remember visiting them as a child. Grandma was always cleaning the house and making her famous potato soup. The whole house would smell delicious. She'd hum, "When the Saints Go Marching On," so often that I would go home to my parents with it stuck in my head for weeks. Grandpa was always out gardening or making wooden lawn chairs to sell when he went into town, and Grandma would bring him out lunch every day and kiss him on the cheek just before going back inside. It was a happy place to be. When my grandma died in her sleep 2 years ago, he didn't have any visible emotion. We expected him to break down and want to leave his cabin in the forest forever, to get away from the memories of her. But instead, he refused to leave, saying my grandma was still with him. I guess that's why we haven't been to see him. My mom thought he was unstable. This past October, on my 18th birthday, I begged my parents to go see him. They shook their heads and told me they just didn't have the time. So now, as a legal adult, I decided to go out on my own. They didn't support the decision at first, but decided not to argue. "Only 3 days, and call me every night," my mother said before I boarded the flight. I could see the worry in her eyes. It was a strange feeling traveling to my grandpa's house on my own. The plane ride seemed never ending, and the taxi driver was so silent on the drive through the forest that it made me uneasy. As I made my way through the forest, I was filled with memories of my childhood. Running through the piles of leaves in the fall, climbing the leaves, playing hide and seek, and that's when I saw it, the cabin that I missed so much. I smiled as I ran up to the door, knocking twice before stepping inside and throwing off my shoes. "Grandpa!" I called as I made my way to the living room. "Grandpa, I'm here!" I couldn't find him. I ran out to the back door to see if he was in the garden. He wasn't there either. I looked around at the trees, trying to see if I could spot him gathering firewood. Maybe he was down by the stream. Just as I was about to go check, I heard my name. It was coming from inside the house. Confused, I made my way back inside. I decided to check upstairs. "Grandpa?" I called again. The stairs made loud creaks, just as they always had. I entered his room and was startled to see him seated in my grandma's old rocking chair, looking right at me. I stepped forward slowly. "Grandpa, didn't you hear me? I've been calling you." He looked at me for a few seconds and then shook his head as if to get himself out of a trance. "Well, of course I did, my little wheelbarrow," he said as he stood up and walked over to hug me. He had always called me his little wheelbarrow, and my grandma had always called me Puppet. As strange as those names were, they had huge meanings ever since I was a child. "How have you been?" I asked as we walked down the stairs. "As fit as a fiddle," he replied as he put his arm around my shoulders. "What do you say we go for a walk and catch up? I can't believe my little wheelbarrow is an adult now." The rest of the day was just like old times, except, of course, for the absence of Grandma. But even then, in some way, it felt like she was with us. The forest still felt like home. Grandpa and I went down to the stream and talked for hours about life. It amazed me how normal he seemed. I couldn't understand what Mom meant. That was until night hit. I had gotten myself snuggled up into bed with my favorite book. The guest room still had the same furnishing and musty smell that I loved. Grandpa had walked in to say goodnight, and right before exiting the room, he turned around and said, "I should get Grandma to make your favorite potato soup in the morning." My mouth hung open for a second, and my eyes couldn't leave his. I didn't know what to say. He smiled and left the room. I sat there frozen with confusion. I decided to talk to him about it in the morning. I woke up to the sound of him building his lawn chairs outside. I threw my robe over my shoulders and headed to the kitchen. He had made eggs and sausages with a ketchup smiley face on the side of my plate. Grandma would do that for me all the time. He noticed me eating and walked inside, brushing the sweat off his forehead. "Good morning," he said with a smile as he sat down beside me. "How did you sleep?" He seemed so happy that I decided not to bring up what happened last night. Like the day before, our day was filled with old traditions. I helped him build his chairs, and we had a bonfire in the evening. My grandpa even brought out his guitar to sing songs like he used to. Now this is where things get strange. I had gone to bed, content with the day I had, and I was woken around 2 a.m. to the sound of humming. It was hard to hear at first, but it seemed to get closer to my door, and the tune became recognizable. When the Saints Go Marching On. It was a song that my grandma always used to hum around the house, and I could hear it right outside my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat as I pressed my hand over my mouth. I couldn't move. I slowly began to pull the blankets up to my face. My eyes searched the room for my phone, but it was so dark I couldn't see it. The door began to push open with a long, drawn-out creak. My eyes squinted to try and see who it was. For a moment, I felt relief when I saw the figure of my grandpa. "Thank goodness," I sighed, almost laughing. "You scared me. What are you doing up so?" His movement was so fast, it made me stop in mid-sentence. He sunk down to the floor on all fours, his head looking up at me, but I couldn't see his face in the darkness. He slowly started crawling towards me, humming the tune I knew so well. I panicked and reached for the lamp up by my bed, quickly turning it on to reveal my grandpa. I will never get this image out of my head. His hands and feet were touching the wooden floor, but his head, oh my god, his head was completely rotated so that his chin was where his forehead should have been. I screamed so loud it echoed throughout the house. This startled him, and his body shuffled backwards out of my room so fast, I barely had time to blink. I must have passed out because I woke from the sunlight seeping through the window over my face. Instant flashbacks of what had happened filled my mind and my breathing quickened. I grabbed my things, threw them into my backpack, and ran for the door. My grandpa must have heard me because he called out to me, "Where's my little wheelbarrow rushing off to before breakfast?" He was in the kitchen. I stopped in my tracks. "I barely got any sleep last night with you screaming. Do you have nightmares often?" he asked. "Come get some food. It'll make you feel better." I began to chuckle to myself. It was a dream. I had had a stupid nightmare that had almost had me on a plane home. I dropped my backpack by the door and walked back inside. As I approached the kitchen, a familiar aroma filled the house. Potato soup. My pace grew slower as I peered around the corner at my grandpa. There he was, back facing me by the stove, cooking potato soup. The weirdest part was, he was wearing Grandma's apron and slippers. "Grandpa, you're starting to scare me," I said softly. I didn't come any closer to him. He stayed silent, adding salt to the soup, still turned away from me. "Grandpa," I continued, "I'm worried about you. Let's head into town for a bit. Maybe you can see someone." It was then that he dropped the spoon he had been mixing with. The next moment has haunted me for the past 6 months. His head turned all the way around just to look at me, as he said, "Don't worry, puppet. Grandma is just fine." Now to clarify something. I read No Sleep to give myself a little thrill, a little chill, a little scare, to prick my nipples a bit before work or something. Something weird like that. I'm a weird guy. But I don't read No Sleep to shit my pants. Do you guys read No Sleep to shit your... I don't. Which, well, I did that. Reading this story. I have to say, this is probably the most scary, horrifying story I've ever read in my life. Maybe I haven't read that many stories in my life, but I disagree with you there, because I have. So good job. Whoever wrote that, real good job. And thanks for watching, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. This was a request by Mr. Coolman. And yeah, here you go, man. I'm bringing back this series. I'm also bringing a lot of old series back and a lot of new series too. So thanks for watching, guys. See you later. Good night.